Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Daniel Ellsberg, an activist and strategic analyst. He was a key figure in the anti-war movement which helped turn the populace against the Vietnam War. His leaking of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times set in motion a series of events, including illegal actions by the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, that led to his resignation. Dan, welcome to Berkeley.
Glad to be here.
When did you first become involved with Vietnam?
I've really never discussed this before in public, but the fact is I was there in 1961 in connection with a task force or a study group for the Kennedy Defense Department on limited war research and development. And our group, which included, I think, a Berkeley physicist, was Alvarez.
Yes, that's
He's not a Berkeley physicist who had been involved in the Manhattan Project. And Shockley, the inventor of the transistor, a number of others, technical people on the whole, except for me, who was representing social science, went really to a number of bases around the world, talking to people about what their requirements might be for spending research and development money, budget money, on things for limited war, for conventional war, since most money had gone for nuclear war research up till that point. And Kennedy was prepared to spend money on conventional war, both in Europe and elsewhere. We went to Vietnam in that connection, and I spent just a week there, but I spent that week very actively reading night and day, really, many hours of reading reports there and talking to the advisory group there. And of course, at that time, which was about August of 1961, there was still only the small number of advisors that were permitted under the Geneva Accords of 1954. I think on the order of 60 or so, a very small number, or hundreds at the most. And I got a picture of Vietnam at that point that led me to decide to stay away from that problem bureaucratically for the rest of my career if I could. I came back and helped write a report for RAND, which incorporated what I learned in that study group. And the advice was basically, don't ask for research money for this. Don't get involved. Stay away from it. This is a total loser, essentially. Because it was already apparent in 61, or earlier for that matter, that there was really no promise of Western efforts to subdue the movement for national independence and sovereignty in Vietnam, which was led by communists. But communists who had beaten the French, who had very strong American financial support, materiel, so forth. We were facing essentially the same people there, and the likelihood that we would do better than the French had done seemed very small. And I actually acted on that to the extent that when I was doing a lot of consulting in the Pentagon, largely on nuclear matters, but I kibitzed on other things.
This would be during the Kennedy administration.
During the Kennedy administration in 61 and 62, 63. I really avoided knowing anything about Vietnam, getting into discussions of Vietnam. I didn't want to be drawn into it. I thought anyone tarred with that essentially would be like being associated with the Bay of Pigs, that perfect failure which had ruined the careers of nearly anybody who had touched it.
But then later, a few years later, you actually went back to Vietnam?
No, I was assigned, actually after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which I participated.
It would have been October 62.
The next year, the fall of 62. I became very concerned about the possibility of nuclear war arising out of a crisis, and about the problematic aspects of decision-making in crises, of understanding what was going on and deciding what was to do. And I could see how a war could have come inadvertently or without either side really desiring it out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I wanted to learn more about governmental crisis decision-making. And I got a study sponsored under Walt Rostow in the State Department Policy Planning Group Council, as an interagency study to look at crisis decision-making. And I actually had people helping me, thanks to Walt Rostow, in every department connected with these matters, at the deputy secretary level, or the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the deputy director of intelligence in CIA, the deputy secretary of state, and in defense. and looking at records, very secret records with high clearances, beyond top secret actually, of decision-making in things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Suez Crisis of '56, at which time I'd been a Marine, actually, in Alexandria Harbor, and had watched British and French bombing during that crisis, so I was particularly interested in that one. The U-2 crisis, a number of others, especially, however, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the course of doing that study in '64, I was invited by the Assistant Secretary of Defense, John McNaughton, a former Harvard professor, to join him as his special assistant. He was asked by McNamara to spend about 60 or 70% of his time as McNamara's man on Vietnam. McNamara, in turn, was sort of running the war for the president. And McNaughton wanted me to spend like 90% of my time on Vietnam, as he put it, to double his effectiveness, to find ways that he could improve his own effectiveness by seeing what he should read and what issues he should look at and so forth. So I was brought back in, somewhat reluctantly, but into Vietnam. That was the situation I was invited to take part in. And I wanted to see governmental decision-making now from the inside, having studied it as a researcher and a consultant for a number of years before that. And actually the first day that I started involving myself in it, reading the cables, as they say, which means immersing yourself in this huge flood of telegraph messages that come from a region, a particular region. I began reading the cables on Vietnam, and almost the first cables I read had to do with an apparent attack on our destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf. It was August 4th, 1964. There had been a daylight attack 2 days earlier on a Sunday, to which the United States had chosen not to respond, other than to fire at the boats who were attacking. Now I was seeing very urgent cables coming in saying that destroyers were again under attack, this time late at night, and their only knowledge of this was by radar and sonar. To leap ahead some years, it was clear in later years that there had been no attack. They were fighting radar shadows and sonar shadows in the water, firing at them, and there had been no torpedoes in the water as they supposed. But at the time, to begin with, they were told very clearly that these boats were under attack. Then at a certain point on that very first day of my involvement, I read a cable that said, hold everything. The Commodore of that two-destroyer flotilla recommended no action be taken till they had a chance to look at the water surrounding them the next day in daylight and see whether there was wreckage or oil slicks or survivors in the water, since they thought they had actually destroyed some boats. There should be some sign of it. There was very strong doubt as to how large the attack had been, or whether there was an attack at all. It was not really possible to confirm that surely that there had been an attack. Nevertheless, the president had already decided by the time that cable was received to this time to start air operations against North Vietnam, the first air operations against North Vietnam, and actually I would say the first air operations since Korea. I've been just the last day or two trying to think of whether there had been anything in between, but I think these were really the first combat operations of that sort we'd seen since the Korean War had ended a dozen years earlier. So here we were launching 64 sorties against North Vietnam. I was up all night. My first day on the job was also my first night on the job. I was up all night in the Pentagon following these raids, which were, and their aftermath, which were taking place on the other side of the world, 12 time zones different, so it was in daylight over there and night for us. And then the next couple of days, the president got Congress to support almost unanimously, only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate, what he was to regard as the functional equivalent of a declaration of war, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which he felt gave him congressional support for a war, although that was not what Congress was led to understand they were voting for. And we were now off on the heavy U.S. combat phase of the Vietnam War, which really went on till '73, and the war went on till '75.
At that time, did you have doubts about what the president was asking the Congress for, based on what you were seeing in the way of the traffic?
Far beyond doubts. The President said to Congress and the public that the evidence for the attack on our ships was unequivocal. He was not calling for a response or resolution on the basis of a possible attack or a probable attack, but that there was unequivocal evidence of attack. That was false. I knew that was a lie. Well before the attack got off, many doubts had been raised, and it was clearly unclear. I think I would have said, and most people there would have said, probably with all this, probably there was an attack. But that was not what the President told the public. He lied to the public. Second, he said, assuming that it was an attack, it was clearly an unprovoked attack against destroyers on the high seas. That was a lie, in the sense that the actual attack that had occurred 2 days earlier was had followed covert, secret, denied attacks by the United States on North Vietnam just the night before. And there had been covert operations. And there had been similar attacks the night before the 4th, the night of the 3rd. So if there had been an attack, again, there was just as much evidence as on the 2nd that it had been provoked by attacks on North Vietnam. McNamara, Rusk, Vance all continued to conceal from the Congress that these U.S. attacks were taking place. As a matter of fact, McNamara, in his book just a couple of years ago, still almost 30 years later, is describing those attacks as South Vietnamese attacks on North Vietnam. That's untrue. It's a lie. They were CIA attacks entirely organized by the U.S. The South Vietnamese had essentially nothing to do with them.
Now, the men you were working with, the environment you were working with in the Pentagon, at what point or how do people deal with this incompatibility between what is being said publicly and what I guess you and others know inside the corridors of power?
Well, I had been consulting for the government, this was now 64, for about 6 years at that point, since 58, in particular since 59, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and now Johnson. And I had seen a lot of classified material by this time, I mean tens of thousands of pages, and been in a position to compare it with what was being said to the public. The public is lied to every day by the President, by his spokespeople, by his officers. If you can't handle the thought that the President lies to the public for all kinds of reasons, you couldn't stay in the government at that level, or you're made aware of it, a week. And I mention that because sometimes later people speculating or saying why they thought I had given the Pentagon Papers to the Times with the expectation that I'd be sent to prison for it, said, as Harrison Salisbury said of the New York Times, he couldn't stand the lying. Well, that's basically foolish. As I say, if I couldn't stand, I was not going to prison for years simply to set the record straight. If you can't live with the idea that presidents lie, you can't work for presidents, period. And that's issue is being raised today. We've been talking about in the Monica Lewinsky case, but I'm talking now about affairs of state, not private matters, and matters of life and death, war and peace. The fact is, presidents rarely say the whole truth, essentially never say the whole truth of what they expect and what they're doing and what they believe and why they're doing it, and rarely refrain from lying, actually, about these matters. It's simply more convenient and more politically effective, they feel, for them to present matters to the public in a way that happens not to be correspond to the reality.
So you focused on one particular set of events when you first came into the government. Subsequently, you became more involved in the war. You actually went to the war and worked there after this period, right? I mean, you were in
Yes,
Vietnam?
starting with this day of August 4th, I spent about 11 months then working on the escalation of the war in Vietnam. In the Pentagon. Then by the summer of 1965, the President had decided on an open-ended escalation of that war. We had been bombing now since February, and were heavily involved. We had over 100,000 troops in Vietnam by that time. We were at war. And I, as a former Marine in peacetime, 54 to 57, a Marine platoon leader and company commander. I didn't like the idea of following a war from Washington. Also, I wanted to understand it better than I felt could be done from Washington. And I volunteered to go to Vietnam with a former retired CIA man named General Edward Lansdale, retired Air Force general, to do liaison work at the embassy with the Vietnamese, feeling that would give me a better chance to understand the war and perhaps avoid the worst kinds of outcomes. I come back to something else. I may have had, around the time I went in '65, hopes that by pursuing the war differently or better along General Lansdale's lines, we might come out with some relatively good outcome, if not a victory, something rather successful. Most of the time I was involved in Vietnam before that, the year before that, and after a few months in Vietnam, it was quite clear that nothing lay ahead for us but frustration and stalemate and killing and dying, but with very little hope of any favorable or even outcome that could be called acceptable, except for the possibility of postponing an open, clear-cut defeat or shift in policy. Presidents, I found from studying it later in the files, had always faced the possibility, had never really faced much recommendation that held out a clear-cut hope of a successful outcome in Vietnam to them. But on the other hand, they had faced the possibility that they could they could postpone that kind of embarrassment or that kind of defeat that was involved in getting out of Vietnam and letting the Vietnamese determine their own politics, which would have meant, clearly, over time, almost surely communist hegemony, communist domination in Vietnam by Vietnamese communists. And their alternative to that was that they could put it off at increasingly higher cost to the U.S. and to the Vietnamese in terms of lives and money and involvement. But at that increasingly greater cost, they could keep the war going. Each president chose to do that. And that's what Kennedy chose, and it's what Johnson chose while he was in office, and it's what Nixon chose until he was removed from office.
We should explain to the audience that in one of your later tours coming back to Washington and being at RAND, you had access to what became known as the Pentagon Papers. Explain what those documents were.
Well, I was in Vietnam for 2 years, from '65 to '67. I evaluated pacification there for most of that time, which took me to most of the provinces of Vietnam. I was in 38 of the 43 provinces. I used my former Marine training, though I was a civilian, to work with troops part of that time, and I was actually experienced combat for some periods, some significant combat. So I saw the war up very close, from the point, as a matter of fact, in an infantry platoon, infantry company. And I got hepatitis, though, actually, probably on one of those field expeditions, and came back to America, to the U.S., left the government and rejoined the RAND Corporation, and was immediately assigned to a project, a historical project that McNamara had organized in the Pentagon, to look, which came to be known as have the title of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968, which is when the study was terminated. I worked on that study in the Pentagon as a RAND employee, but a consultant to the Pentagon and to the study. I was one of about 36 people who did that, nearly all of whom had served in Vietnam, most of whom were military officers. I drafted the volume of the study on the Kennedy decision-making in 1961. Actually, I chose that for a reason related to what I said earlier, to my earlier visit. And I kibitzed on a number of the other volumes. And I was given access to I was the only researcher in or out of the government who was given access to the entire 47 volumes of the study. It was 7,000 pages, top secret, for the purposes of research. Copies of the whole study were given to about a dozen people from their former official capacities, people like McNamara, Clifford, William Bundy, and Paul Warnke and others, none of whom used it for research. I think they all counted on using it for memoirs or at some later time, but they weren't, it was just sitting in safes. In my case, I had it in a safe in my office, a top secret safe, for the purpose of working on a study called Lessons from Vietnam. I was actually, oddly, the only person being paid on a U.S. government contract or salary to look at lessons from Vietnam, strangely enough. The government was not obsessed in improving its performance by learning lessons, except for McNamara's effort to produce this study for later historians. And that was a very interesting lessons learned study. But my hope now was to, most of the people who'd worked on that had read only one volume of it, the one they worked on. Perhaps they'd looked at a few other sections. No one had read the whole study, except for Les Gelb, who was in charge of the study and supervised all of the volumes. He was probably the first person to read it all. I was probably the second person, and eventually Gelb's boss in the Pentagon, Morton Halpern, who later went to work for Kissinger, did come around to reading it all. And for some time, there were really only the three of us in the country who had read that entire study and were able, in effect, to learn the lessons of the entire sweep of that period, that 23-year period from 1945 to 68.
As one reads your book, which came out in the 70s, Daniel Ellsberg, Papers on the War, and the theoretical piece that emerged after reading the Pentagon Papers and working on them, one is impressed apparently with an awareness on your part of the larger political context of the decision making. Was that something new for you?
Well, not entirely a good question. You mean in Vietnam?
Yeah, right.
No, it was very obvious from on August 4th.
Right. That first day.
First day.
Yeah.
That it was very heavily political, was affecting the decision very much, because we were very aware that the reason the president was in such a rush to show decisive action against North Vietnam at that moment, and didn't want really to wait, as recommended by Captain Herrick, to wait for the next day, was, first of all, that would look somewhat less decisive to wait a while, but you could afford to wait 24 hours and investigate. Actually, that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was it might turn out that there wasn't good evidence. There might have been an attack, but you didn't have good evidence of it, and that would make it hard to carry out the attack. Now, he wanted to carry out that attack, so it was advantageous to do it quickly before you had negative evidence as to whether there had been an attack at all on those early cables. Now, why was he in such a rush and so determined to carry out the attack? That had everything to do with the fact that he was in a political presidential campaign facing a Republican who was a reserve Air Force Major General, Barry Goldwater, who was calling for bombing of Vietnam and a much more aggressive stance in the Vietnam War. Now, actually, Johnson was, on the one hand, could easily have said, well, I agree with that policy. Let's talk about things we don't agree with. Actually, he did pretty much agree with it. But he wasn't telling the public that. Again, the campaign was determining the fact that he was giving the public a totally misleading impression of his willingness to expand the war in Vietnam. He was telling them what the public wanted to hear, the majority, that we were not planning to expand the war. We seek no wider war, as he said. That was, however, a lie. It wasn't that he actually was happy about the need for a wider war, but his advisors had all long concluded that if we were not to lose in Vietnam, and he was certainly determined not to lose, the war would have to get wider. And he accepted that prospect, but not till after the public had voted. In short, the entire campaign was based on a lie, but that was for political reasons. He could have gotten elected anyway against Goldwater if he'd been totally frank in every respect. But he wouldn't have won the landslide that he did win. And he won that precisely by giving the false impression that there was an enormous difference between his Vietnam policy and Goldwater's, when in fact there was not an enormous difference. There were some rather marginal differences between them. So I was aware on that first day then that the decision-making, the lying, the secrecy, the concealment, and what we were doing, the actual airstrikes, were all determined by presidential domestic politics at that moment. The desire, by the way, to hit Vietnam was a more strategic question. That had to do with avoiding defeat in Vietnam. But the importance of doing it on August 4th and not waiting till August 6th, when you might not be able to do it at all because you had no evidence of attack with you, that all had to do with domestic politics. Now your question was that all news for me, and was I shocked by this? And the answer is no. Perhaps much earlier it would have been quite shocking and news to me, as would the lying. But by this time I'd been studying crisis decision-making, and I was aware that in every single crisis, the very fact that it was a crisis had everything to do with domestic politics. That was even true, very much so, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was aware from my work on, we haven't gotten into this, my main work had been on nuclear planning and nuclear command and control from '58 on. And I actually drafted for Kennedy the Department of Defense guidance, the civilian guidance to the war plans for general nuclear war. I did that in '61. And it was the basis for general war planning for many years thereafter. And I was a specialist on presidential command of nuclear weapons. That brought me into the Cuban Missile Crisis. But quickly in the crisis, I not only noticed right away that there was no particular new or desperate security problem for the United States involved in having 10 or 20 or 30 missiles on Cuba, because there really was no major difference between having them on Cuba and having them in Russia. There was a psychological difference and a political difference, very much so. But as McNamara pointed out to the president in the first meeting on this issue, there made no essential military difference. There were marginal differences about flight time and warning, but they didn't add up to any very desperate change in the situation. Why then was there such a crisis? And the answer was, above all, domestic politics. Because the Republicans were calling for an invasion of Cuba, not because of missiles, but because of Soviet military aid, and because Castro was a communist, and was getting a great deal of military aid from the Soviets. The Republicans were pressing strongly for airstrikes or for an invasion or a blockade of Cuba. That had led Kennedy to take quite a strong position at one point, that if there were missiles there, he would take strong action. He said that on the assumption the Russians would not be so reckless and provocative as to put missiles there. But having made the statement, he now had a stake in not appearing to back down from that statement. Moreover, the Republicans in Congress continued to press him in Congress, and even went so far, Keating, Senator Keating, or rather he was at that time, I believe, Representative Keating, was claiming that there actually were missiles in Cuba from his sources, which the administration, the administration was denying. He may have gotten that from McCone, who was a Republican but head of CIA. When my study actually of the Cuban Missile Crisis showed, I talked to the man who showed the photographs to Kennedy. When they finally had photographs that there were missiles on Cuba. And he mentioned that Bobby Kennedy had been outside the office before he was going to show them, I think later to McGeorge, to somebody else. So he showed them to Bobby Kennedy first. And I said, what did Bobby say? And he said, Bobby said, oh shit. It was an oh shit situation. And he said he then proceeded, as did the president, to describe it entirely in domestic political terms. And as Kennedy's first reaction was said to have been, this will make Keating president, which it didn't, of course, but it was, I think it did make Keating senator, if I'm not mistaken. It was crucial in his campaigning for senator. And they did think that their first reaction was, we're in trouble domestically. And whereas McNamara and others' first reaction was that we could with reluctance and anguish, afford to live with those missiles in Cuba, just as the Russians had to live with American comparable missiles in Turkey right on their land borders. We could do the same if we had to. It was very clear to the president, no, we can't. And the reason we couldn't was domestic political reasons. It would be too costly for him to appear weak and appeasement-minded and accepting of such a Russian move. And the very provocativeness of it was that the Russians were saying, we have the same status that you have. If you can put missiles on our borders, we can do the same to you. We're not doing more or differently, we're doing the same. And what they were saying was, we are now big boys, we are your equal, we're not number two anymore, we have the same status. That was indeed a provocative and blatant thing to do, not in military terms, but in diplomatic and political terms. And for Kennedy to have accepted that bid to be our equals at the nuclear table, the nuclear club, would have been a humiliating setback for him, which I realized had led him to take steps which brought us to the brink of all-out nuclear war. He was prepared to take a risk. I don't believe he would have had any mind of taking a certainty of nuclear war for that reason, but he was definitely prepared to set in motion a process that risked all-out nuclear war, hundreds of millions of deaths, to avert that short-term domestic political embarrassment.
What then, obviously, you remained for many years part of the government, part of the team, willing to live with the elements of this decision-making process. After much frustration with Vietnam, after reading the Pentagon papers, you reach a different conclusion about what is acceptable and what is moral in a light of this. Explain how that change in your thinking came about.
Well, I learned in Vietnam nothing very new about the lack of good prospects for success. I went to Vietnam pretty much with that perspective, or certainly I had it in 64, and I had it in 61. I did learn the faces of Vietnamese. I learned to be concerned for what happened to Vietnamese people in a way that my colleagues back in Washington probably didn't feel. They had a reality for me. They weren't just numbers, and they weren't just abstract ciphers of some kind, as they were for people, and as I would have to say probably for myself, people in other parts of the world that didn't have that same friendly awareness in my mind. I wasn't aware of them as friends and associates and so forth. That was a consideration. What I particularly learned, though, in 1969 was, and not now from the Pentagon Papers, was that Nixon, a fifth president in a row now, was choosing to prolong the war in vain hopes that he might get a better outcome than he could achieve if he just negotiated his way out and took what he could get and accepted essentially a defeat. He hoped to do much better than that. In fact, he hoped to hold on to control of Saigon and the major populated areas indefinitely for the United States, that these would be subject to our will and our policy and not be run by communists. And he hoped to do that actually in ways similar to the way Johnson had hoped, by threatening escalation of the war, threatening bombing of North Vietnam.
Go ahead, no, go ahead, yeah.
And that he was making such threats, and that he was prepared to carry them out.
Right.
I did not believe the threats would succeed, so I foresaw a larger war. He was fooling the public about what he was doing at this time for the same reason Johnson had. The public would not at that time, had in 64, the public would not at that time have supported a continuation of the war, let alone an expansion of the war. But he was successfully fooling the public, who didn't want to believe that any president could be so foolish and so narrow-minded in his own interests as to keep that war going after the Tet Offensive of 1968. So I saw a replay of 64 and 65 coming again. I saw once again a president making secret threats, almost sure to carry them out, and deceiving the public as to what he was doing. By reading the Pentagon Papers, which I finished doing in the fall of '69, in September '69, I now had a sweep, a historical sweep, sufficient to reach a conclusion that would have been very hard, very unlikely to reach without reading that. And that was that there was very little hope in changing his mind from inside the executive branch. For example, by giving him good advice, or by giving him realistic estimates of what was happening in Vietnam. Because what I saw by reading the earliest days of the Pentagon Papers, going back to 45 and 46, was that every president had had such advice as early as Truman. Truman had seen predictions of an indefinitely prolonged guerrilla war facing him, and yet had gone ahead in supporting the French in this effort. And this had happened year after year. And it happened year after year for Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson. And the fact now that Nixon was embarked on a new course held out very little hope that he would be more responsive just to good advice about getting out than any of his predecessors had been. And that meant that if his decision was going to be changed, and because I cared about Vietnam and this country, I felt quite urgently that I wanted the United States to stop bombing them and stop killing Vietnamese. I saw that the pressure would have to come from outside the executive branch and would involve a variety of things, but it probably required better information outside the executive branch, in Congress and in the public, about the past and about the present than they had. If I had had documents on what Nixon was planning, what I'd been told he was planning by colleagues who were working for Nixon, I would have put those out. At that time to Congress to warn them of what was coming. I probably would not have bothered with the thousands of pages of history that involved the earlier presidents. I would have involved I would have shown what Nixon was doing. But I didn't have those documents. And at that time, it was very hard to get the public to believe or to act on the possibility that a president was lying to them or deceiving them. That was not in American consciousness, and it was a very unpopular notion even to put forward. I once said in a courtroom in defense of some people who were on trial for resisting the draft that the president had lied. The judge stopped, this was in early '71, before the Pentagon Papers had come out. The judge stopped the proceedings, called the lawyers up to the bench. I could hear what he was saying because I was in the witness box next to him, and said, "If you elicit testimony like that again," he said to the defense lawyer, "I will hold you in contempt. I will not have statements about the president lying in my courtroom." That was this in a trial of people who were resisting the war nonviolently. Right. And they weren't allowed, in effect, to have witnesses who said anything like that the president was lying. The Pentagon Papers changed that.
Right.
7,000 pages of documents of presidential lying did establish forever, I think, and they were confirmed, of course, by Watergate a couple of years later, that presidents all lie.
You mentioned your awareness of what was happening to the Vietnamese people. You mentioned your awareness of what Nixon was contemplating doing, but which you couldn't talk about. Were you also affected by the demonstrators and the moral positions that they were taking?
Less so by the demonstrators, actually, than by people that I met who were paying a much higher price in their lives to make a very strong message than people were in a demonstration. People who were going to jail rather than go to the draft in Vietnam, and rather than go to Canada or become COs or go in the National Guard, like as Clinton made an effort to do, and so forth, or Quayle or others. They had a number of options to avoid combat in Vietnam, including being a conscientious objector. But they chose actually to make the strongest statement that they could, that the war was wrong that it should end, that they would not cooperate with it in any way, even by accepting CO status, and that they accepted prison as a result. I met one in particular named Randall Keeler in late August of 1969. And when I understood to my amazement that he was, I hadn't known it earlier, that he was on his way to prison shortly, that he was about to be tried for draft resistance and expected to go to prison, where he did go for 2 years, it had a shattering effect on me to realize that we were in a situation where we'd come to a point where men as attractive in their intelligence and commitment as Randy Keeler found that the best thing they could do was to accept prison, to try to raise a moral issue to their countrymen. And when I realized that was the best thing he could do, he was doing the right thing, but that defined the situation we were in, a terrible situation. I felt that we were eating our young, like cannibals, or worse than cannibals. We were eating our own children. We were relying on them to pay the price for somehow getting us out of this war, sacrificing them like cannon fodder in the war itself. And that they should be joined by people who were willing to do what they were doing, and that was do everything one could, truthfully and nonviolently. These were Gandhians, in effect, and I had by this time, it so happens, been reading Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and now I was meeting people who were living the life that I'd been reading about. And with the constraints then of truthfulness and of nonviolence, I realized that following their example, I was prepared to do anything I could, and that meant giving up a career and meant going to prison. So I asked myself for the first time, what could I do to help end the war if I were willing to go to prison? Now, it wasn't at all clear that putting out the Pentagon Papers, which I thought would send me to prison, would be one of the better things I could do. It was history. It didn't prove what Nixon was about to do. It only suggested that he might do the same as all these other presidents. And I really was trying a number of other paths that looked more promising. They were less dangerous, but more importantly, they looked more powerful. I was trying to arrange that I could testify before Congress. I was trying to get hearings started. I was participating with others in writing letters from Rand. It's a small measure, but since it was an unusual thing for people in the Rand Corporation working with the government to say bluntly that we should get out of Vietnam, it was in fact a rather powerful move. As such things went, more promising than putting out the Pentagon Papers, actually. But I was also copying the Pentagon Papers in hopes of strengthening some of these other moves, such as my testimony to Congress, for what it might be worth. I didn't think actually it had much chance of affecting events, but it had some chance. And I was ready to do anything I could, and that was one of the things I could do.
What, any other factors that help us understand? And I'm also interested here in kind of inner strength. It's not the easiest choice to make, and for any individual.
No, good questions really. It so happens I've been thinking about this later because of something I'm writing recently. Something I'm writing. So some thoughts have even come into my head just recently that I wouldn't have pressed as much before. I mentioned reading the Pentagon Papers, which was crucial to my understanding of what needed to be done, and that was pressure from outside the executive branch. And I'll get to the point you just raised in just a moment. Another point, though, was that reading the Pentagon Papers burned out of me the desire to work for the president. I saw 5 presidents in a row, now including Nixon, who had been mistaken in this stubborn, selfish, foolish way, year after year after year, for what was at this point now 24 years. And the idea that I'd had since I was a boy, and that most Americans have, we talk about growing up to be president, and not many of us, other than Clinton. Clinton is a rare example of somebody who really had that seriously in his mind. But more people than that get the opportunity to work for the president, and when and that can go pretty widely. When I was a Marine lieutenant, I already thought of myself as working for the president, because the Marines tended to think of themselves as a fast reaction force that was at the president's disposal, a kind of presidential guard. And so I think more than one does, I believe, in the Army or the regular Army. The Marines tend to think of themselves as at the president's disposal, and have that feeling of self-esteem that comes from that, and identifying with the president. And that made it more natural for me, as I say, to go into the executive branch. In the executive branch, everybody gets the habit of saying, we did this, we did that, speaking of the executive branch. It's a strong identification with being a president's man or president's woman. In those days, few besides secretaries, few women were actually in this position or chose it. Now there are quite a few. But so the men who did this did think of themselves as president's men without having to be in the White House. And here I was the first, actually in '69, the first RAND researcher who did work directly for the president's assistant for national security. I did staff work for Kissinger on Vietnam. In the very beginning of the administration, that was, no RAND person had done that before. And that was very prestigious and very exciting. Many, many people inside and out of the executive branch think that the opportunity to work in the executive branch is the highest calling that an American could have. You're working on national security matters, above all. You're working for the national security in the most powerful, effective way that you could possibly have. Nothing that you could do, write articles, write books, work for a congressman, be a congressman, none of that could compare with possibly informing and influencing a president. And that was true whether or not you had voted for that president or worked for his party or not. There was only one president at a time, and the chance, whether he was, whatever party he was, the chance to have some useful influence in informing him or shaping his policies seemed the most important thing you could do. Reading the Pentagon Papers and reflecting on Vietnam revealed to me, first of all, that presidents could go terribly wrong despite the best advice they could get. And that therefore the best way of helping the country was not necessarily helping the president do what he wanted to do, because the best way might be keeping him from doing what he wanted to do, and that had to be done outside the executive branch, by Congress, by courts, by voters, by the public. So that actually you could do more for the country outside the executive branch. And second, the aura of the president, the idea of identifying with him and working for him and being a president's man, a kind of feudal relationship, chivalric relationship, Knights of the Round Table, working for the king. That suddenly lost its aura. I no longer wanted to be a president's man. The idea of life outside the executive branch, I think, suddenly had a possibility for me, or alternatively it looked just as good or better than working for a president. And I don't think I've ever had a colleague who has ever reached that point in their lives. They can't imagine life outside the executive branch as being better when their party gets out of office, or if they're fired, or if they move out for higher money or whatever. They nevertheless spend the rest of their lives waiting for the phone call to be called back and give advice. No matter how painful the break was with the earlier president, they're ready to go back there. It's their highest calling, actually. Self-esteem, prestige, excitement, importance, and a sense of serving the country. That somehow was burned out of me by reading this 7,000-page record. And that made it possible for me to imagine doing something that I think very few of my colleagues have ever been able to imagine, and that was doing something that would forever prevent me from working for any president again. No executive branch official would ever or could ever hire me again after I had done this. Now, that would apply to quite a range of activities, all of which are ruled out for most officials or former officials. They just cannot conceive of doing that. They can conceive of leaving a particular president. They can't conceive of doing something that would keep future presidents from relying on them or trusting them or calling them in again. So that was crucial. And finally we come to the point that one of the things I was doing By the way, pretty much everything I was doing in terms of working with Congress was compromising my ability ever to work for a president again. That was going too far. But one thing I was doing was likely to put me in prison. In fact, I thought certain to put me in prison, which is another prospect. How could I do that? Actually, I'd been in the Marine Corps, I'd been in Vietnam, I'd been in combat. 3 million men who went to Vietnam as soldiers exposed themselves to losing their legs, their bodies, their lives to a mine or to a sniper or to a mortar round. And they were not regarded as heroes just because they accepted that role, or crazy. Nobody did a psychiatric profile on them, as was done on me, to ask, why did they do that? They were doing it for the president or for the country. The president, however, who decided what was good for the country? The president. He was deciding very badly, and not just he, but 5 of them were deciding very badly here, and that wasn't even too hard to see. But you did what the president said, what he wanted you to do. And to do that is sensible, as you say, rational, even if it involves your death, even if it involves your killing people in what is in fact a bad cause. A bad cause by any other standard than the fact that the president has endorsed it. And this was a bad cause. We can come back to that. So dying, killing in a bad cause, all of that is regarded as very reasonable. And I had done it. I had been over there, even when I didn't believe in the cause. I served the president. I was learning from the inside about the government. I had various reasons, which didn't seem in retrospect good enough to justify what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. And the point was that what Randy Keeler revealed to me was that there were other ways of being conscientious than serving the president. There are other kinds of courage. And I had to ask myself, well, if I was willing to be blown up in Vietnam or captured, as friends of mine were, when I accepted the cause or supported it, should I not be willing to go to prison or risk my freedom? And when I faced that question, it was quickly answered. So I'm just saying, when you say, how could I be willing to face that? Well, I was the kind of guy who had been willing to go to Vietnam. That didn't make me unique. You know, it put me not with everybody in the country, but with a lot of people. Oliver Stone had volunteered to go to Vietnam, remember, for that experience, as did lots of other people. And so what the connection, however, that not many of them had occasion to make was between doing that sort of thing and making the same kind of commitment against the president's will and policy, against what he wanted to do, against what he was demanding, and to put yourself in the position of a dissenter, or of, let's say, a congressman who opposed the war. But to shift, so I'm saying that one shift was from the executive branch to helping the Congress and working in the public. A major shift of identity, very, very difficult for an executive official to make. Another one, of course, was a willingness actually to go to prison for what I was doing. And that was because I made the connection with what I myself had done in Vietnam. But I hadn't, or the Marines, but I wouldn't have done that without the example of thousands of Americans who did that. Actually, Esquire magazine called me just last month. They're doing an issue on heroes, and they asked me if I would say if I had a hero that I wanted to name, and I mentioned Randy Keeler as a person who had changed my life by his example.
I regret to say we have only time for one more question. We may continue this in another session, but what then briefly is the responsibility of an individual in a democracy on matters of war and peace, like we've been discussing?
Well, let's narrow it down to the responsibilities of people with inside information, as I had, as tens of thousands of people had much the same information I had, and the same convictions I had, that we were on a wrong course and that it ought to end. There were also, of course, others who somehow believed in what we were doing, often because they were new to the problem. But people who'd been with it for a while found it very hard to believe that we were on a good course. People like McNamara then, who understood years before they got out of office that what we were doing was hopeless and was resulting in deaths on both sides that served no useful United States or other human purpose. What could they have done and what should they have done? Did they do all that they could have done? I can say very briefly in terms of what I've just said about my own decision.
Yeah.
I think that what I learned about what I ought to do applies not only to them at the time, but to people in the future. First, that we are fortunate in this country, in our Constitution, in having not just an executive in charge of war and peace matters, as it likes to think that it is in charge, but actually a Congress which has the constitutional responsibility both to declare war and to finance, to control the budget, and has many, many methods for actually opposing executive policy on a matter of war and peace. Any of those executive officials, I'll take McNamara as an example, could have, or could in the future, in a situation like Iran-Contra, for example, think of informing Congress with or without the approval of the president. They would do this, by the way, with almost no legal risk. There are many ways they could do this with no legal liability. In fact, to the contrary, it often involves simply telling the truth instead of committing perjury, which is what they actually do. So it involves obeying the law rather than violating the law, and obeying the Constitution. But it's in a way that they hardly think of doing because it involves crossing the man who appointed them. They could then take McNamara, could have encouraged hearings by Fulbright, could have told him what questions to ask, could have provided witnesses for him, could have testified himself truthfully instead of falsely under oath, which is what he did do, and could have provided the Pentagon Papers in a timely fashion, could have given him the documents, told him what documents to ask for. In short, work with Congress to change the situation. That's a very powerful and very practical way, which almost nobody ever dreams of doing. It would certainly keep them from ever being hired by a future Republican or Democratic president. But as I say, there is life outside the executive branch. Second, they really could conceive of taking risks with their own career that are comparable to the risks they routinely ask of draftees and volunteers that they are sending to war. They could contemplate, in other words, paying a price in their own lives by telling the truth, by informing the public, by acting conscientiously and in a committed way outside the executive branch to tell the truth, to inform the public, again at great cost to their future careers, but a cost that they should be willing to pay. In short, they would find that they had much more power as individuals than they imagine they have if they were willing to pay a price in their own lives.
Dr. Ellsberg, thank you very much for joining us today for this quite fascinating and morally uplifting conversation on international affairs. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.